Got your maps from last week. You can pull them out. We'll take a look at that first map. If you didn't bring yours back, I brought the extras back there. They're there, but if you've already got one, then please put that one back when you leave tonight. But these are maps because what we're doing is looking at the Holy Land. And I've just always felt like if you know the geography, if you know what the country, the lay of the land, you know that, then a lot of things clear up. You understand why things happened and where they happened. And we did just an aerial survey of the Holy Land last week, just taking like a flyover, just looking at the territory, the 4 sections of the Holy Land and the rivers and such things as that. But tonight I want to go straight here to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And God had called him, promised him to give him the land. And as I said, the call of God to Abraham and his descendants and to the people of Israel, this has so much to do with the land, the Holy Land. And even today, you see the fierce loyalty and desire to maintain that land that they have, the Holy Land. So they will fight for it and not going to give it up easily. So this is ancient promise. They even in the war times such as this, the Jews go back to say, this is our land, and this is the deed to it right here in Genesis chapter 12. So we looked at that, and let's look at Abraham, or Abram. He was called Abram early on. And Abram went as the Lord had told him. Isn't that something the Lord tells you and you do it? Isn't that, what's the matter with you? You know? It's just amazing to me when God speaks and says, and Abraham went. He just obeyed obediently. And Lot went with him. Now, he might wish Lot had not come with him, but he does. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and all the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem. Okay, first geographical point we're going to make after the land of Canaan. Traders, remember I told you last week, Canaan means those who are traders or merchants. That's the kind of land in which they lived, a lot of trade routes through there. But Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem at the Oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. That's bad. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. He built an altar to the Lord there. You begin to see a pattern here? Wherever the man goes and lives, he builds an altar, which is what we ought to do. We ought to go find a place, a church, build a church, whatever we have to do, to build an altar and to sacrifice there unto the Lord. So this is my place of service. So wherever he goes, you'll watch, he builds an altar. And he called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram journeyed by stages to the Negev. You notice a couple of times, it started out in verse 4, the Lord told him, and then down here in verse 8, he called on the name of the Lord. You see that's in all capital letters. You understand why that's in all capital letters, don't you? Look, for instance, back at, let's see, where did I see that? Down in verse 7, Lord is not in all caps, is it? When you see Lord, that's in capital L, little O-R-D, that's Adonai, that's the master, the Lord. When you see it in all capital letters, that's God's personal name, which the Jews would not say, would not pronounce. It's something like Yahweh or Jehovah. And that's why you see sometimes different ways of spelling of capitalizing or not capitalizing these things. You understand? So he calls, according to verse 8, he calls on the name of Yahweh. Now, that's important because everybody else is calling on the name of Baal there, or Molech, or someone else like that. But he calls on the name of Yahweh. Well, his trip began up in Ur, as we talked about last week, way to the north, up in what would be probably Iraq at this particular time, there on the banks of the Euphrates River. He moved there with his father, and God called him to leave there. And he makes a journey of a total of about 1,500 miles with his wife and his nephew Lot. I'm sure, and they didn't have any kids, so nobody's asking how far are we, how much longer we are. Your kids don't do that, do they? No. How much longer? Right? And they didn't have that problem, so they went on, traveled a long, long distance, and Lot is not his son, it's his brother's son, but he wants to travel with Uncle Abram. And they traveled up the Euphrates River to Haran, and then that's where he heard God's call to go on down to the land of Canaan. Now, do you understand what it means to leave the clan? If you live in a world without a police force, without a government that can back up policies and things like that, nobody left the clan. Nobody left the family, because you stick together, because if somebody makes war on you, then you've got to have the clan, the family, to stick up for you. So for Abram to take his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot and their family, their servants, workers, to take those and leave Haran and he left his father and his brothers up there in that land and moved away. Now, what does that take? Faith. To step out where you've never been. Where are we going? To a land I will show you. Well, yeah, I can just explain to my wife, where are we moving? Well, some place we've never been before. We don't know anything about it. The Lord said he would show us the land. I wonder how Sarah took all that. Anyway, they made their move down to the land of Canaan, and God said, I will show you a place. And the first stop is called Shechem. You got your map, you'll find Shechem on there. Oh, let's see where Shechem is. Shechem is just about in the middle of your map, in the yellow territory. It's north of Jerusalem, but you'll see Shechem there, near Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. As a matter of fact, those mountains sort of make it a funny shape, and Shechem means shoulder, so the place looked like a shoulder off of a mountain is what it looked like. And he goes first of all to Shechem, and this is one of the oldest Canaanite cities in all the world, even mentioned by the ancient Egyptian pharaohs who lived long before this time. And they even mentioned Shechem. So Shechem is one of the oldest cities in all of the world. And it became known, really went through a lot of transition through the years, a lot of wars and what have you, became the city of Samaria by the time of the late Old Testament. But he camps under, notice he says he camps under the Oak of Moreh. The Oak of Moreh. That's a place in Shechem, geographical feature, a big oak tree. They had oak trees, and this was a sacred tree. Moreh means a place where you learn. It's a place of teaching. And it was a worship center where the Canaanite people taught about their God, about the various gods of the Canaanites, some of whom we'll come across later on. But it's a place of learning. So you can imagine he goes to this place, Shechem, and there is the major feature outside the city there is the Oak of Moreh, where the Canaanites gather to learn about the Canaanite gods and the Canaanite worship. It's a Canaanite worship center is what it really was. This worship center in the presence of the Canaanites made this place really unsuitable for Abram. But he did build an altar, kind of his first claim. First time he's been in the promised land. God gave this land. It's going to be yours, but boy, the Canaanites are pretty heavy around Shechem. But he built an altar there as a claim. God claims this country, this territory. And I'm sure the Canaanites did not appreciate that or think about that, but he built an altar there and he sacrificed unto God and worshiped this place called Shechem. He moves on. He doesn't stay too long in Shechem, but Shechem is quite an important city. See there's one highway that's on the map, the red line that runs right through it, but there was another lesser highway through there. So it was on a trade route. It was a busy place, pretty good sized place. Had big city walls, had a big temple to Baal there. It was at its heights during Abraham's days, which would be about late 17th century BC. Good water supply, fertile land, lots of crops, 2 highways, as I said, very wealthy and powerful city. So a lot of Canaanites made that their home and their worship. But this is a place where Abraham looks around and says, I can't live here. You understand the theology sometimes of having to move. Sometimes you have to move on from old friendships, from old places, from old habits, from old people, because it's not healthy for you. And he decided, I can't live in this place because this place is so given over to the Canaanite worship, the Oak of Moreh. They instruct there. It's like a big seminary or school or something there where they teach these people. Well, he moves on a little bit after a little bit there, but Shechem appears many, many times. Let me just remind you of a few places where it appears. Abraham's grandson was named Jacob, and Jacob stopped in Shechem after his 20-year absence from the promised land. He had run away from his brother, who he thought was going to kill him, and he stayed 20 years in a foreign land. And then God called him to go home. And so he did come home. And when he left the promised land, he had this wonderful experience with God at a place called Bethel. He said, this is the house of God. This is where I'm at. This is the place of the ladder ascending and the angels ascending and descending on the ladder. And he says, I'm coming back to this place. God, if you bring me back safely home one day, I will come back here and I will serve you right here in Bethel. But the problem was, 20 years later when he returned, he went to Shechem because Shechem was a lot of fun. Shechem was the big place. Bethel was just an old dirt place with not much going on there at that particular time. But oh boy, Shechem was the place, and Jacob decides to stay there, and he buys some property there. Now keep in mind that he bought some property and built an altar there to God, trying his best to live according to Genesis 33. He built an altar to El Elohe Israel, the God of Israel, and as a testimony to the people of Shechem that there's a really true God, and these people didn't know his God, but they had their own gods. Jacob learned a hard lesson about breaking a promise with God, didn't he, when he went and settled in Shechem? He said, I promise you, God, I'm going back to Bethel because that's where I met you. But he goes to Shechem instead, and he gets in trouble. And one of the things which happened was his daughter Dinah. You know, he had one daughter and all those 12 sons. And Dinah was taken and raped by a man named Shechem. And Jacob tried to make peace and live in the land, but 2 of her brothers, Simeon and Levi, attacked the men of Shechem and killed many of them, plundered the city, And Jacob had to go away. Jacob told his sons, we have to move from here because you made my name stink. Is what he literally said. You made my name stink among the people of Shechem. And so that's how he got a really hard lesson. And he packed up one day. He took all the foreign gods because living in Shechem, his kids were beginning to worship the gods that were worshipped at Shechem, the Canaanite gods. And they had all their little figurines and all their little amulets and all those kinds of things like that. And he took them out to that oak tree at Moreh and buried them under that tree. And he said, we're going to Bethel. I bet his family screamed because Bethel was just a little no place. Shechem was where the action was. But it was that's just another place. Shechem has a long, interesting history. You remember when Jacob sent his son Joseph out to find his brothers, and he couldn't find them. He roamed the countryside, tried to find them, and then he went to Shechem. And at Shechem, they told him that they'd gone over to Dothan. You know where Dothan is over here in Alabama. They'd gone over there, and they found the animals over there in a place called Shechem. And that's where Joseph was trapped in this particular area. He was captured, and he was hauled away to Egypt one day. Joshua, some 400 years later after these events, helped bring the Israelites out of Egypt and began conquering the land of Canaan. And they had something very interesting happen at Shechem. They had a funeral at Shechem. You know whose funeral they had? Joseph, who had only been dead for 440 years. But you know, when Joseph died down in Egypt, he said, do not bury me here. Bury me in our land, our home. Because they didn't know that they'd ever get back to the land of Canaan, which God had promised Abraham. They should have known, but they didn't. But he said, do not bury me in the land of Egypt. Take me back to my land that I'm supposed to inherit in the land of Canaan. And so the Egyptians embalmed him, which the Jews did not embalm like the Egyptians did. So the Israelites kept the old boy in a box, and I'm sure kids for the next couple of 100 years saying, what's in the box? And they said, that's Joseph's bones. Why don't somebody bury the old boy? Well, we're going to. Joseph says we're going home one day. When he died, he said, you're going home to the land of Israel, the land of Canaan one day. And when you get there, you bury me there, but don't bury me in Egypt. You know where they buried him? Shechem, in the very property that Jacob bought when he came there. So that property was redeemed, I think. Well, that's part of the history of Shechem. Joshua also called an assembly at Shechem one time, and after they began conquering the land, they had a big revival meeting there and all kinds of things. Joshua explained the law to the people once again, the covenant. And Joshua built a monument there in Shechem, and you see more and more they're claiming that land. And he put up a big stone monument, according to Joshua chapter 24, under a certain oak tree. You see, God has conquered. God will always conquer. The world doesn't think he will, but when God says, I'm going to do this, he does it. And that oak of Moreh is no longer a pagan place, but it becomes a part of the inheritance of the Israelites, of Joseph's family, and designated later on as a city of refuge. So that city was transformed by these people. Ironic that it was done at the same place that Abraham had stopped about 500 years earlier. Well, Shechem was eventually destroyed and rebuilt a couple of times. And Rehoboam, remember when they had the civil war when Solomon died and Rehoboam and Jeroboam fought? Well, Rehoboam went to Shechem to be crowned as king, according to 1 Kings chapter 12. Today it's kind of a miserable kind of a little place. I understand a tribe of Samaritans lives there. So let's get back to Abraham. Abram had gone to Shechem, but Abram leaves Shechem, and he's soon on his march to the south. He spends most of his life to the south. Isn't that good for us, Southerners? He knew a good place, didn't he? He went to the south. And he went to a place called Bethel. And actually between Bethel and Ai. And he built his second altar there. Abram built another altar. He had built one in Shechem when he first arrived. He moved over to Bethel and he built a second altar there. Once again, this is claiming this world for God. When you build a church, when you build a place of sacrifice, an altar of sacrifice, you're claiming that this place for God. East Brewton First Baptist Church, built here, you're claiming this place for God. Don't forget that. This is God's place. He built an altar there. Well, we ought to talk about Bethel because what city is named most times in the Old Testament? Obviously easy. What? Jerusalem. But you know what the number 2 most mentioned city in the Old Testament is? Bethel. You didn't know Bethel was so important, did you? Well, he goes and builds an altar in Bethel, and it's, like I said, mentioned more often in the Old Testament than any other except Jerusalem. By the time the Old Testament book of Genesis was written by Moses, Bethel had its name changed. It was originally a place called Luz, L-U-Z, but somebody changed the name there. Remember who changed the name? Jacob. Jacob, running away from home, came to Bethel, afraid his brother was behind him, coming to kill him. And as he made his way up to this place called Luz in those days, earliest days, and as he stopped in Luz, he crawled over to the side of the road. He was so sleepy, he put a rock for a pillow. And during that night, he had that dream where God came to him and began straightening his life out. He had a lot of straightening to do in that old boy's life, but he started. And when Jacob woke up after seeing the vision of the angels ascending and descending, he said, I didn't know where I was. I thought I was at Luz. But this place, he said, I'm going to call Bethel. Bethel, house of God. I didn't know I stumbled into the house of God. Here I've met God in this particular place. And he maybe took his pillow and a couple of other rocks and piled them up and poured oil on them and said, Dear God, if you bring me back home safely one day, I'll come right here and worship you and claim this land for you at Bethel. Well, it became quite a big city through the years, and had one wall around that city was 11 feet thick. So they faced a lot of enemies. Abraham stayed there for a while, but there came a famine, and he went down to the land of Egypt. Later on, he will return to the Holy Land, but he doesn't stay long in Egypt, but he does avoid the famine. His grandson Jacob goes, according to Genesis chapter 28, is the one who visited, as I just explained. As he visited that place next and changed the name of it. He's actually the one who named it Bethel instead of Luz. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. This is an awesome place, none other than the house of God, he said. House of God. You know, he has 2 very interesting experiences with God. One is at Bethel, where he meets God for the first time and makes these promises to God. Has this dream. And so he gets up and he names the place Beth-El. Beth means house in Hebrew. El means God. I named it Beth-El. 20 years later, he comes back down the other side of the Jordan River and he camps beside the Jabbok River, which just feeds into the Jordan River. And he lies down there to sleep that night, and that's when he has another experience, doesn't he? Remember what he had that experience? He wrestled with an angel. and begging for a blessing. He was scared to death, and he begged for a blessing from God and received this blessing from God. And that's where his name was changed at that particular place. And he named that place Peniel. Peniel. Pan means face, El means God. He named that place Face of God. So he named two places after God: Bethel, house of God; Peniel, which means face of God, where he had these two amazing experiences with God. Well, as I said earlier, he and his family decided to live in Shechem when they did return to the land, even though he had promised God he would go back to Bethel. But they lived in Shechem until all the trouble started, and then he returns to Bethel. You keep your promises to God, or, there's trouble. And he did have trouble. Being disobedient to God, you have trouble one thing after the other. And he had trouble in Shechem, one thing after the other. And then he goes to Bethel, and he built an altar there, just as his grandfather Abraham had built an altar. It marked a new beginning. He starts burying family idols and gets out of the country and stays in Bethel. Jacob's mother's name was Rebekah. Remember Rebekah, Isaac and Rebekah? Rebekah had an old nurse whose name was Deborah, and she was still alive at this particular time when they were in Bethel. And he buried her there. It was a very special place, and he buried her in a place that kind of, I guess he called her his second mama, probably. Nana, mama, whatever. And he buried her under an oak tree in Bethel, and he named it the Oak of Weeping, because it was such a heartbreaking thing. It was at Bethel that God changed Jacob's name to Israel and renewed the covenant. Genesis chapter 35, if you want to read that. And so Jacob set up another marker in Bethel and anointed it and worshipped. According to Genesis 35:11, he called on the name of El Shaddai. You see, a new name for God. Your translation probably says God Almighty, but this is El Shaddai. You ever sing that song, El Shaddai, here? Yep, we've sung that, haven't we? And this is where that name came from. He found God at Bethel, and he worshipped El Shaddai, God the Almighty. Well, according to Judges 20, the Ark of the Covenant was moved to Bethel one time. So it had quite a history. Samuel had a circuit. The judge, he would go around in a big circuit. Samuel the judge, and one of his stops where he held court was in Bethel. So it was an important place. When King Jeroboam broke off the northern part of the kingdom and started Israel, and down in the south there was Judah, but he made Bethel the chief city for worship there in his kingdom. And he put, what did he put in Dan at Bethel? Y'all recall what he put there? I'm checking all what you've learned over these years. In Dan and Bethel, Jeroboam put two golden calves, golden altars, and brought the people there to worship. He did not want people to go to Jerusalem by that time, where they had the temple. And Bethel became such an awful place over the years that Amos, the prophet Amos, comes to Bethel one day and prophesies, and it gets run out of town. Now Bethel, as I said, is second most named city in the Old Testament. It is never mentioned in the New Testament. Wow, just cut it off. Abraham went on from Bethel pretty soon, went to the Negev. Did you see the Negev, the place that's on the map? The Negev is down to the south. I wrote it in for you, down toward about 2/3 of the way down. It's in my handwriting there. Negev, Negev. Negev means south. He moved to the south. Now, Negev could just mean a direction, like north, south, east, and west. But it also became the name of that area, which is just like in the United States, you talk about the South. Well, you talk about the direction or the part of the country where we live, and we call it the South. And the Negev was the South. And that's where he goes and spends Abraham goes and spends the most of the rest of his life. He goes down there and he moves, according to Genesis chapter 12, he moved to the Negev by stages, which indicates that he was a big herder, had lots of cattle and sheep. And he has to move them in stages, like a giant cattle drive or something like that. And he moves down to the Negev in sections like that. And he worships the Lord there for a while. And God continues to bless him. Just like he said in Genesis 12, I will bless you, boy, I'm going to bless you. And he did bless him. And he blessed him with great numbers of herds and flocks. It became so much that his nephew was also being blessed, and Abraham was being blessed, and so there was not enough grass and water to take care of these two huge operations. So they're at Bethel. There you are at Bethel. And on that highway, but just below Shiloh, north of Jerusalem. And there they were at Bethel getting ready to leave, and he calls Lot and he says, Lot, it's obviously we can't live this close together with our huge flocks and herds. So he said, I want you to look, and I want you to choose what part of the country you want. That's amazing. God promised this land to Abraham's descendants, but he gives Lot the first opportunity to claim whatever he wants. Look around, claim what you want. Now Bethel is where they've been serving God, where Abraham had built an altar and where he had been serving God. Lot couldn't believe this great opportunity that he had. So look at Bethel and look to the right where all that green is and where the Jordan Valley is, north of the Dead Sea. That was called the swelling of the Jordan in those days. It was the most incredible grasslands. It even had jungles in it. There were lions and bears that all lived in there. The last of the lions, before all the lions disappeared there, were soon only found in Africa, just not too far south of there. But he looked at that from the hills, from the top of Bethel, and he said, this is what I want. Well, the only problem was down there at the lower third of the Dead Sea were the cities of the plains, which included Sodom and Gomorrah and Admam and Zeboim and some other awful, awful places, Admah, Zoar, all those kinds of places. And that's where he decides he wants to take. Now that was a dangerous, dangerous place. Abram stayed in the hill country along the yellow part down here and moves down, up and down from the Negev and those places, while his nephew Lot is over to the east around the southern part of the Dead Sea. Look at the Dead Sea again. You see the Dead Sea? Did it show up on your writing? I hope it did. The Dead Sea is a funny looking sea. And as I mentioned to you last week, there's an indention of land that comes from the east and goes in and almost cuts it off. You see, it almost squeezes off the southern part of the Dead Sea. That part, which is south of there, was not part of the Dead Sea originally. It was the place of Sodom, Gomorrah, Zoar, and all those wicked cities of the plain. And something happened there, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But that's what Lot wanted. Abram stayed in the highlands with God, is the way I always see it. And this boy goes down to the plains of the Jordan because it looks so delicious and wonderful down there and so easy to raise his cattle. And of course, he lost his family down there. He lost his wife there, and he lost his home there, lost everything he had there eventually. Dead Sea, as I told you last week, is the deadest place, the lowest place on the face of the earth. Some 1,650 feet, I think. If you're on the surface of the Dead Sea, you're at the lowest point on the surface of the earth. The Dead Sea is 30% salt, whereas the ocean is 2% salt. It's a desolate place. There are no seashells there because there's no life there. There are no fish there. The only thing that you see washing up on the shores of the Dead Sea are dead branches which were brought down from the Jordan River, and they would sort of wash up on the shores there. As I told you last week, as the salt water evaporates, it leaves that sand, and the merchants come down there, and that's where you got your salt in those ancient times. Caravans would come down there, shovel up the salt, carry it back to Jerusalem and other places, and they would sell the salt. But when God told Lot to get out of that place, I'm going to destroy it because it's such an evil place. Genesis 19, it's that awful, awful story. It says, and God rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire. And that's when this geological tragedy happened at the south end of the Dead Sea. Those cities were buried underneath there. You know what it teaches me about God's judgment? When God judges, it is bad. The deadest place on the face of the earth is where Sodom and Gomorrah are. God warned them. The deadest place of all on the earth. And it was an awful, awful kind of an experience there for those people. Well, back after the events of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abram, as I said, settled finally in the Negev. He was moving back and forth in the Negev, and it was not a real rich land, but it was a land where he could raise his sheep and his cattle, and but he had to change pastures. He was a nomad. He was a herder. They didn't go and build a city and live there for the rest of their lives, but they would live in their tents, and they would go and they would dwell for a while over here, and then they would have to move to another place, and then another place, and they made a circuit around that way and that's the way the herder life is. He was not what you call a farmer who put down his fields, although he did have crops, but not on a long-term basis, but he has his herders. You've heard of the wandering Arameans, maybe? They were wandering herders, and Abraham fits into that part. Abraham spent the rest of his days in the south country in Negev, except for one trip he'll make to Mount Moriah, which we'll talk about when we get to Jerusalem. But he's going to eventually go down here and settle. You see Beersheba? Way down there, there's a dotted line that runs through there. Beersheba, Exodus route. And that's where we're going to pick up next week as he makes his final stop in Beersheba. Okay? If you didn't get maps, there's still a few copies out there, and we've just been using map 1 so far, but we will get to these others, the Lord willing, soon. But we'll pick up Abraham in that area and move on to all these famous places, Jericho and all those other places, as we'll get into those next week. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for leading your people. Lord, we realize that like Abraham, we are pilgrims. You have a land that you're giving to us, a home. We just follow your plan in faith. We'll arrive at home one day. We realize that Abraham didn't buy that land except a burial place. But Father, he went where you told him to go. And one day you took him home. And one day Jesus told that parable, that story of Lazarus and the rich man, and you showed us that he had finally arrived at home, a place not built with hands, but eternal in the house of God. Thank you for Abraham's faith. May we be the kind of faithful people who realize we are pilgrims passing through this world enjoying your blessings, obeying you, but headed to the promised land. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.